We've taken the time to explore a little bit more in depth how the express routing works in terms of how it's structured in the library. We got a little bit hands-on. We wrote some code examples with some console logs just to kind of see and reinforce the idea of how the express middleware chain works and how we can leverage some of those aspects to implement a really well-designed and modularized routing system for our application. In the last two lessons, we've been working in this server.js file, and we've got all of this code that is left over from there. And you can see when I was talking about the design of our server, what I meant by we don't want to really pollute the server.js file. We've just got 2 or 3 root handlers that we've defined in the server.js file, and already the size of this file is starting to grow. And you can imagine if you have 20, 30, 40, 50 endpoints that you have request handlers for, this will soon start becoming very unmanageable. It's not going to be very clean and definitely going to be hard to understand what's going on. So we did do the work here just to kind of make it easier to understand the concepts that we were talking about. But now that we've gone through that, the next step is to start abstracting this route away. Before we remove the actual code here, let's go ahead and set up the folders and the file structure we need. At the root of the lib folder, then we'll just create a file. We're going to call this, that'll be setuproutes.js. And to start off, we're going to start writing some code here. We're going to create a function that we want to export. So I'm going to call this function setuproutes. We're going to assign that to an ES6 arrow function. And for now, let's just put a very simple console log in here. I'll just give this a return character and we'll say testing setup routes function. And this setup routes function is going to act as the entry point that we can reference in other parts of our code base that will just handle all the work of initializing and set up the routes for our Express API. But before we start implementing, let's just go ahead and wire this up to our server.js file. And at the top of the file, we can just say import, and we'll just import that setup routes function. And that'll be from the setup routes file. Then all we need to do to test if it's wired up correctly, we can reference the setup routes function and we can just invoke it. And we can just do that right above our router that we were using in the last lesson. I'm going to go ahead and save my work. We'll see that we get that testing setup routes function console log, and that just validates to us that that has been set up correctly. So now that we have the setup routes function, we can start moving all this work that we've done in the previous lesson and move that out of the server.js file and into the setup routes file. So I'm just going to go ahead and actually remove all of the code that we set up in the last lesson. And I'm just going to delete that out. Your server.js file should look something like this now, very nice and clean. The whole setup of our API routes will come from this one function, which the entry point is in the setup routes.js file. So we'll just adjust the console log a little bit more, just to make it a bit more readable in the terminal. And then we'll see, yes, we get that testing setup routes function, console log is being fired. And so now we can go ahead and start implementing some of our work. Because the setup routes function is going to be doing a lot of work related to initializing our routes for our application, we're going to need the Express library, so we'll go ahead and just import this at the top of the file. We'll say import Express from Express. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to, outside of the body of the function, I'm going to create an instance of Express router, which will act as the high level or the main router for our whole application. So I'm just going to create a constant here. We'll call this router, and we'll reference the Express library and that router class, which we can then just assign to the value of this router here. And now we've got access to a router that we can then start working with. And just to start with very small steps here, all we're going to do is reference the router instance we've just created. We're going to go ahead and use that .use method, and then we'll reference a /. So that's going to be any request that comes through on the base path of our API. And then we'll just go ahead and create a handler for that. And for now, we're just going to work with the request and the response. I'm going to go ahead and put another console log here. I'm going to give it a number 1 because this is kind of the first piece of middleware in our chain now. I'm going to say main router middleware. And then we'll just say, we're not going to invoke or make use of the next callback. We're just going to end the request response cycle right here. And so we'll just say res.sendStatus. And I'm just going to simply send back a 200 for now. We don't have to pass back anything fancy. I'm just going to go ahead and save our work. And so just to walk through what we've done so far, we've imported the setup routes function at the top of our server.js file, and then we just invoke that function. And all that function is doing at the moment is it's printing out a first console log, which is the testing one. The second thing that it's doing is it's grabbing a hold of an instance of the Express router, and it's registering one request handler that we've created here, and it's assigning it to the base path of our API. All that's going to do is log out that one console log, and it's going to send back a 200. The problem here, and we'll test this in a moment, is even though we've registered this middleware in the setup routes function, we haven't attached this middleware to our actual instance of the HTTP server, which is the Express instance. So if we send through a response to anywhere in our API, including the base path, we send through a response, you'll see we just keep getting back the 404 not found. Even though we see this console log of testing setup routes function that's being printed, we know that the setup routes function is being invoked, but the middleware that we've set up is not being hit. So we need to figure a way how to attach all of that middleware that we've registered in the setup routes function onto our main instance of our Express application, which in our server.js file is assigned to this HTTP server variable. A very simple solution that we can use here is we can make use of dependency injection, and we can grab a hold of that HTTP server, which is our instance of Express. We can say HTTP server and just pass that in as an argument into the setup routes. I'm going to go ahead and save our work. And then in the setup routes function that we're exporting here, we can then just grab a hold of the instance of Express that is being passed in. And so we can just set up a simple parameter in this function here, and we can kind of rename this or call it what we want. Just remember that what's being passed in here is the instance of Express that's been created when we initialize our Express server. It's named HTTP server in our server.js file, but I just want to rename this to app, and that's going to just conform to the convention of Express. Once we have set up that parameter, we can get access to that Express instance and reference it here by saying app, and then we can make use of the .use method. And remember, this method can be used to mount specific middleware onto the instance of Express. And so I'm going to match this to the path of just one single /. So that's the base path of the whole API. Whatever traffic comes in to the base path, we just want to hand that off directly to our router. And that is that router that we've defined at the top of the file. And that router then will have different sets of middleware that is attached to it. And so it'll flow through that middleware pipeline that is created as we build this out. For now, that's the mechanism of how this kind of all works together. We've now attached that router onto our Express instance. And if we go and do some testing now, we'll be able to verify if we have successfully achieved this. If you go ahead and click send there, you'll see you get back a status code 200, and you'll see that we get that console log saying the main router middleware function has been hit. So whatever we pass in here, whether it's a /API, ping, or whatever we decide to pass in, so all the traffic that comes into our Express server is now being routed to this router, which has been set up here. And then whatever middleware that we set up here, we can then guarantee that the traffic is going to flow through that. At this point in our workflow, I want to introduce one small change into our Express API here. At the moment, we've just been kind of working with this base path using the /. I actually want to introduce a prefix into our API routing. So instead of just referencing the /API, I want to create this higher level path here called /API. And that's going to act as like the entry point into our API. So every endpoint from our API going forward needs to start with the prefix /API. Any traffic that comes through to /API will then be passed on to the router. The first piece of middleware is registered with the base. So all that's saying is that any traffic that comes after the API, whatever endpoint it is, it must flow through this piece of middleware that we've defined there. So we can just go ahead and test that real quickly in Postman. You'll see if we adjust our request now to hit the base, we're going to get a 404 not found. And now, in order for us to access our API endpoints, we're going to have to start using the /API prefix. And if I hit send here, you'll see we get back that 200. And so anything in our API going forward, whether it's a ping or a user or whatever, the path needs to be prefixed with the API. So that's one small quick change that we can make. The reason why this becomes useful down the line is if you look at the syntax that we're using here, app.use, and then we're attaching this router onto this /API, we basically able to create little mini apps or mini modularized routers and then attach them to different API endpoints. And the reason that this can become quite useful is that we can do things like attaching different versions of our API and assigning them to different modules of routers. So for example, if we had to create a different like modularized router that we say for a different version of our API, so we'll say router v2, and then we'll just create a new instance of the express router here. And remember, we can just keep on creating these instances of express router because they're singletons. So every instance of the router that we create can be like a module where we then can just assign methods on. So for this router v2, we can just set this up so we can test this real quick. You can say router v2, and then we'll just use this .all to catch all HTTP status, HTTP methods. And we'll just, on the base path of this router, we'll just set up a very simple request handler. We'll say rec and res there. We'll set up a quick console log, and we'll say v2 API middleware. And then we'll just end this and with a response, and we'll say send status. Let's do something different to what we have up there, and we'll just send back a 500. What we can do is reference this app and then register this whole modularized v2 router, and we can say app.use. And then we can say anything that comes onto the v2 path /API then must get sent through to this v2 router. If I go ahead and save our work here, we can go and test this in Postman. Right, and I've left out the trailing / of our path here. Just remember that's important. So it's a /v2/API. I'm going to save my work. So in Postman, we can just make a request to our API. We get back that 200, as well as we see the console log there, the main router middleware function. However, if we then reference our v2 API and I click send there, you'll see that we get back this 500 internal error. We're hitting the high level router on the base path console log. So now any traffic coming onto the v2 API is going to actually go through onto this v2 router, and then the traffic will flow through the v2 router's middleware chain. So that's just something I wanted to show you and quickly demonstrate. I'm going to delete this code. Now I think you have a solid idea of why we're going to use this API prefix. We've done some initial good work up until this point to start moving our router in the right direction. We've written a bit of code here. We've done some testing. Let's just take a short break here. We'll pick up right where we left off, and we'll continue working on our router. So I'll see you on over there. Cheers for now.